January 15, 1945. Near Łódź, Poland. The frozen earth trembled beneath the thunder of Soviet artillery. Shells screamed overhead, bursting against German fortifications with concussive roars that shook the ground like an earthquake. Smoke and snow mingled into a choking haze, blotting out the winter sun. Amid the chaos, Sergeant Ivan Petrov of the 1st Belorussian Front pressed forward, his PPSH-41 submachine gun clutched tight against his chest, the drum magazine rattling with each step. The Vistula Oder offensive had begun only days earlier, and already the Red Army was tearing through German lines with a ferocity that stunned even hardened veterans. Petrov's platoon advanced through shattered villages, past burning farmhouses, and across fields littered with abandoned Wehrmacht equipment. The Germans were retreating, but not without resistance. Machine gun nests spat fire from half-collapsed bunkers, forcing Soviet infantry to crawl through ditches and frozen gullies. As the assault pressed deeper, Petrov's unit received orders: storm a German command post hidden in a manor house on the outskirts of a small town. Intelligence suggested it was a hub for local defensive coordination. The manor loomed ahead, its stone walls scarred by shellfire, windows blown out, and the roof partially collapsed. German sentries fired sporadically from the upper floors, but their resistance was desperate, fragmented. Petrov kicked in the door, the wooden frame splintering under his boot. Inside, the air reeked of cordite and dust. A German officer scrambled to draw his pistol, but Petrov's PPSH barked, cutting him down before he could fire. His comrades surged in behind him, grenades clattering down hallways, explosions echoing through the chambers. Within minutes, the manor was theirs. But what Petrov found in the basement was far more valuable than prisoners or weapons. Descending into the dimly lit cellar, he discovered a map room, tables covered in charts, documents, and radio equipment. The walls were plastered with situation maps marked in red and blue grease pencil. German staff officers had fled in such haste that their plans lay exposed, untouched. Petrov's breath caught as he scanned the maps. They revealed the Wehrmacht's crumbling defenses, depleted divisions stretched thin across impossible front lines, reserves reduced to skeleton units, and gaps yawning between positions. The once feared German army was a shadow of itself. For the first time, Petrov realized with absolute clarity, Berlin's defeat was not just possible, it was inevitable. He called his men over, their boots crunching on scattered papers. "Comrades," he muttered, pointing to the maps, "look at this. They have nothing left. Nothing." The soldiers exchanged glances, their exhaustion momentarily replaced by grim satisfaction. The war was not yet over, but the path to victory had been laid bare before their eyes. Outside, the rumble of Soviet tanks grew louder, advancing westward. Petrov folded one of the maps, tucking it into his tunic. He knew headquarters would want proof, but more than that, he wanted to carry this revelation himself, a soldier's certainty that the enemy was finished. The manor house burned behind them as Petrov's platoon rejoined the offensive. Snowflakes drifted through the smoke, settling on helmets and rifles. The Red Army was moving fast, faster than anyone had imagined. And now, with the enemy's secrets in hand, Petrov marched with renewed purpose. Berlin was waiting. The manor's cellar was dim, lit only by a flickering lantern left behind in the chaos. Sergeant Ivan Petrov leaned over the massive oak table, his gloved fingers brushing across the maps spread in disarray. Each sheet was marked with German unit designations, arrows of retreat, and desperate notes scrawled in pencil. The Wehrmacht situation was laid bare. Divisions that once boasted tens of thousands of men now reduced to mere battalions, reserves scattered and understrength, defensive lines collapsing like brittle ice. Petrov's breath fogged in the cold air as he studied the markings. He could almost hear the panic of the German staff officers who had fled moments before. The maps told a story of exhaustion. fuel shortages crippling mobility, ammunition depots depleted, and reinforcements that never arrived. The once mighty Wehrmacht was bleeding out, and the Soviets were closing in. His comrades crowded around, their eyes widening as they traced the lines. Corporal Mikhailov, a wiry veteran with a scar across his cheek, muttered, "They're finished. Look here, whole sectors defended by barely a regiment. And here, nothing but Volkssturm militias." He spat on the floor, contempt dripping from his voice. Petrov folded one of the maps carefully, sliding it into his tunic. He knew headquarters would demand these documents. But for him, the revelation was personal. For years, he had fought through forests, swamps, and ruined cities, facing an enemy that seemed endless. Now, for the first time, he saw proof that the German war machine was hollow, a shell waiting to collapse. Above them, the rumble of Soviet armor grew louder. T-34 tanks rolled past the manor, their tracks grinding over frozen earth, turrets swiveling westward. The offensive was moving with astonishing speed, sometimes 20 kilometers in a single day. The Germans had no depth left to resist. Petrov imagined Berlin, hundreds of kilometers away, its streets filled with civilians clinging to false promises of victory. He thought of the German officers who had once barked orders with confidence, now reduced to scribbling desperate arrows on maps that no longer mattered. The war's end was written here, in grease pencil and fading ink. He turned to his men, his voice steady despite the pounding of artillery outside. "Comrades, remember this moment. We are not just fighting. We are witnessing the enemy's collapse. Every step we take now brings us closer to Berlin." The soldiers nodded, their faces hardened by years of war, but lit with a flicker of hope. They gathered their weapons, slung captured radios over their shoulders, and prepared to move out. The manor house groaned as flames licked its upper floors, smoke curling down into the cellar. Petrov led them back into the frozen night. Snow crunched beneath their boots, mingling with the distant cries of retreating Germans. The Red Army was advancing relentlessly, and the maps in Petrov's tunic were more than intelligence. They were a promise. Berlin's defeat was not a question of if, but when. The night air was sharp, biting against exposed skin as Sergeant Petrov and his men trudged westward. Their breath rose in clouds, mingling with the exhaust of the advancing T-34s. The offensive was relentless. Columns of infantry, armor, and artillery surged forward, pressing the Germans back mile after mile. The frozen roads were littered with abandoned vehicles, broken wagons, and discarded weapons. Every step carried the Red Army closer to the Oder River, the last great barrier before Berlin. Petrov kept his hand pressed against his tunic, feeling the folded map against his chest. It was more than paper. It was a revelation, a glimpse into the enemy's unraveling. He thought of the German officers who had once commanded with iron discipline, now reduced to scribbling desperate arrows across collapsing front lines. The Wehrmacht was no longer the juggernaut of 1941. It was a fractured, exhausted force, bleeding men and material at every turn. The platoon marched through a village reduced to rubble. Roofs sagged under the weight of snow, walls pocked with bullet holes. A lone horse wandered between the ruins, its ribs visible beneath its coat. The civilians had fled long ago, leaving only silence and the occasional crack of distant gunfire. Suddenly, the silence broke. A burst of machine gun fire rattled from the tree-line. Petrov dove into the snow, his PPSH barking in reply. His men fanned out, returning fire with Mosin-Nagant rifles and captured German weapons. The firefight was brief. Volkssturm militia, old men and boys, armed with outdated MG-34s and hunting rifles. They fought desperately, but their resistance collapsed under the weight of Soviet firepower. When the shooting stopped, Petrov rose, brushing snow from his coat. He looked at the fallen Germans, their faces pale in the moonlight. They were not soldiers in the true sense, just civilians pressed into uniform, sacrificed to delay the inevitable. Petrov felt no triumph, only a grim recognition of the war's cruelty. The platoon pressed on, the sound of artillery growing louder with each kilometer. Soviet Katyusha rockets screamed overhead, their trails lighting the night sky before crashing into German positions. The earth shook, and the horizon glowed red. Petrov's thoughts returned to the map. It had shown reserves that no longer existed, divisions that were mere ghosts. The Germans were fighting with shadows, clinging to lines that could not hold. The Red Army was advancing faster than anyone had predicted, and Petrov knew why. The enemy had nothing left to give. As dawn broke, the soldiers reached the banks of the Oder. The river stretched wide and dark, its surface rippling under the winter wind. On the far side lay Germany proper, the road to Berlin. Petrov stood at the water's edge, the map still tucked against his chest, and whispered to himself, "It's only a matter of time." The offensive was not yet finished, but the end was in sight. The Oder's dark waters stretched before them, a silent frontier marking the threshold of Germany itself. Soviet engineers worked feverishly along the banks, laying pontoon bridges under constant artillery fire. Shells whistled overhead, exploding in geysers of mud and ice, but the Red Army pressed forward with unyielding determination. Sergeant Petrov crouched behind a shattered wall, watching as columns of infantry prepared to cross. The air was thick with smoke, the ground trembling beneath the roar of Katyusha rockets. Petrov's platoon was ordered to secure a crossing point. As they advanced, they encountered pockets of German resistance, remnants of divisions that had once been formidable. But now, the defenders were a patchwork of exhausted soldiers, Volkssturm conscripts, and hastily assembled units. Their uniforms were mismatched, their weapons worn, their morale shattered. A firefight erupted near a farmhouse overlooking the river. German machine guns rattled from the upper floor, forcing Petrov's men to dive into the snow. He signaled Corporal Mikhailov, who lobbed a grenade through the window. The explosion tore through the room, silencing the gunfire. When the Soviets stormed inside, they found young boys and old men among the dead, faces that revealed the desperation of a nation scraping the bottom of its reserves. Petrov paused, staring at the scene. These were not the hardened Wehrmacht veterans he had fought in 1941. These were civilians pressed into service, sacrificed in a futile attempt to slow the inevitable. He felt a pang of grim recognition. The maps he carried had foretold this collapse, and now he was witnessing it firsthand. The platoon pushed onward, securing the farmhouse and clearing the riverbank. Soviet tanks rumbled across the newly laid pontoon bridge, their tracks clattering against steel plates. The offensive surged westward, unstoppable. German artillery fired sporadically, but their shells fell short, their barges weak and disorganized. Petrov unfolded the captured map once more, tracing the lines with his finger. The German defenses were unraveling exactly as the documents had shown. Thin lines stretched across impossible distances, reserves that no longer existed. The Wehrmacht was fighting with ghosts, clinging to positions that could not hold. He turned to his men, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Comrades, this is the end of their strength. Every kilometer we advance, they grow weaker. Berlin is waiting, and nothing can stop us now." The soldiers nodded, their faces hardened by years of war, but lit with a flicker of anticipation. They had fought through forests, swamps, and ruined cities, endured hunger and exhaustion, but now the path was clear. The enemy was finished, and victory was within reach. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Red Army pressed deeper into German territory. Fires burned along the riverbanks, smoke rising into the night sky. Petrov marched with his platoon, the map tucked safely against his chest, a silent testament to the enemy's collapse. Berlin's defeat was no longer a distant dream. It was a certainty written in ink and blood. The Red Army's advance was now a torrent, sweeping across the plains of Germany with unstoppable momentum. Villages fell in hours, towns in days. Sergeant Petrov marched at the head of his platoon, the captured map pressed against his chest like a talisman. Each skirmish, each shattered German position, confirmed what the documents had revealed. The Wehrmacht was hollow, its strength spent. The roads westward were clogged with evidence of collapse. Burned-out Panzer IVs lay abandoned in ditches, their crews fled or killed. Horse-drawn carts carried wounded men toward the rear, while columns of prisoners shuffled east under Soviet guard. Petrov watched them pass, once proud soldiers now gaunt, weary, their eyes empty. They were not the enemy of 1941, brimming with confidence and steel. They were remnants, fighting only because they had no choice. At dusk, the platoon bivouacked in a ruined barn. The men huddled around a small fire, their faces lit by flickering flames. Corporal Mikhailov leaned against a beam, staring at the smoke curling upward. "It's strange," he muttered. "For years, we thought they were endless. Now look at them. Boys, old men, scraps of divisions." The maps told the truth. Petrov nodded, his gaze fixed on the folded paper in his hands. "Berlin is already defeated," he said quietly. "They just don't know it yet." The next morning, the offensive surged forward again. Soviet artillery thundered across the horizon, flattening German positions before the infantry moved in. Petrov's platoon advanced through fields churned by shellfire, past trenches filled with abandoned rifles. Resistance was sporadic, desperate, but never coordinated. The Germans were fighting with shadows, clinging to lines that dissolved under pressure. As they neared the outskirts of Frankfurt and der Oder, Petrov unfolded the map once more. The markings were clear. This sector had been defended by a division that no longer existed. The men who had once held these lines were gone, consumed by the war. The Red Army was walking into gaps, exploiting weaknesses that the Germans could not repair. That night, Petrov stood on a hill overlooking the city. Fires burned in the distance, smoke rising into the cold sky. He thought of Berlin, still hundreds of kilometers away, its streets filled with civilians clinging to false promises. He thought of the officers who had scribbled these maps, their hands shaking as they tried to hold back the tide. The war was not yet over, but its ending was written here, in ink, in blood, in the silence of collapsing defenses. Petrov felt the weight of history pressing down on him. He was not just a soldier fighting for survival. He was a witness to the inevitable. Berlin's defeat was guaranteed. The march westward became a relentless tide. Soviet columns stretched for miles, infantry trudging through mud and snow, tanks grinding forward with engines growling, artillery batteries leapfrogging to keep pace. The Red Army was no longer advancing cautiously. It was surging, confident that the enemy's backbone had snapped. Sergeant Petrov walked among them, the captured map pressed against his chest, a silent reminder of what lay ahead. Every village they entered told the same story. German defenses were scattered, improvised, and hopeless. Trenches half-dug, machine guns abandoned, Volkssturm units surrendering after firing only a few shots. The once feared Wehrmacht had become a patchwork of remnants, unable to hold the line. Petrov's platoon encountered resistance only in fragments, small groups of soldiers clinging to ruined houses, firing until their ammunition ran dry, then fleeing into the forests. One evening, as the platoon bivouacked near a railway junction, Petrov unfolded the map once more. By lantern light, he traced the lines leading toward Berlin. The arrows of retreat, the collapsing sectors, the empty reserves. It was all happening exactly as the documents had shown. The Germans were fighting with ghosts, their divisions reduced to names on paper. Corporal Mikhailov leaned over his shoulder, his voice low. "Do you see it, Ivan? They have nothing left between here and Berlin. Just scraps." Petrov nodded, his eyes fixed on the capital marked in bold letters. "Berlin is already defeated," he said. "We are only marching to claim what is inevitable." The men sat in silence, listening to the distant rumble of artillery. They had fought for years, endured hunger, exhaustion, and loss. Now, for the first time, they felt the certainty of victory. The war's end was not a dream. It was a destination, waiting just beyond the horizon. Days later, the Red Army reached the outskirts of Berlin. Smoke rose from the city, its skyline jagged with ruins. The streets echoed with the crack of gunfire, the cries of civilians, the thunder of Soviet shells. Petrov stood at the edge of the battlefield, the map still tucked against his chest, and felt the weight of history pressing down on him. The documents he had captured weeks earlier had foretold this moment. The Wehrmacht was finished, its defenses shattered, its reserves gone. Berlin's defeat was not only guaranteed, it was unfolding before his eyes. Petrov tightened his grip on his weapon, his breath steady in the cold air. The final battle had begun.